2024, an election year like no other. From the candidates to the issues, from voter integrity and analysis, we'll discuss debates, trends, patterns, election laws, and more. This is Vote 2024, Path to the Polls.
Donald Trump is up in the polls. Election watchers say if the election were held today, it looks like he is in the driver's seat and has the edge against an unpopular incumbent. But look, his problems are mounting. Many of those problems, many say, are of his own making. The news cycles, they're negative. I can't begin to count the headlines. He's had to recant comments about cutting Social Security. Not the first time. He has offended Jewish voters, said if he's not reelected, there would be a bloodbath, though he said that comment was taken out of context. That is arguable. Campaign coffers are running low, and there's the whole issue of not having the, quote, personal fortune he said he had to post civil bond. It's all fodder today on Path to the Polls. Appreciate you joining us. And joining in on the discussion, News4JAX political analyst and head of the Jacksonville University Public Policy Institute, Rick Mullaney. Rick, good morning. Thanks for being here.
Good morning, Bruce.
So Trump's still in an enviable position, up in the polls, as I said, but even his own people are worried he might beat himself if he's not careful. There have been some missteps. He's got a lifeline yesterday. An appeals court gave him 10 days, 9 days now, to pay that bond that dropped from some $464 million to $175 million. That's a 64% reduction. Legal analysts say that's highly unusual to be reduced by that amount. Your reaction?
A couple reactions. First of all, it's important to distinguish the judgment from the bond. And the viewers should know, of course, that the judgment remains in place. What the judge found is a $355 million judgment against Donald Trump. And with interest, it comes to over $450 million. This was about his appeal and the amount of money he has to post to take the appeal. That would have been yesterday about $465 million. Instead, it's $175 million. Big victory for Donald Trump in getting that amount reduced. And he's got cash on hand, and I expect him to make that bond. The second point, however, Bruce, is that I think Donald Trump has been pretty effective politically in using this case, this civil fraud case. It's not a criminal prosecution. It's a civil fraud case brought by the Attorney General, Letitia James. And his basic argument is this is politically motivated, that she ran on coming after him, and this is what she found. No one lost any money. So a couple things. He had a significant lifeline yesterday, but remember, it's still hanging out there. That judgment hangs out there. The appeal will take many months, but a significant victory, and he does use it politically to his advantage.
Well, he uses everything to his political advantage. I mean, that's Donald Trump. So he has to pay that $175 million. Is he out of lifelines now? Because if he doesn't pay it, and he said he had $500 million. If he doesn't pay it, Letitia James is going to come after him.
She is. She's made it clear that she would begin to seize his assets. In fact, that could have started happening as early as yesterday if the court had not reduced it. I fully expect this time, however, he will post this bond. That is manageable. He does, I don't know if he has $500 million on cash, but he does have the ability to make this $175 million bond. He's going to comply with the order of the court. And I think you fully expect him to make this bond and to go on appeal.
Right. The most important thing to Donald Trump is his wealth. You know, there's no disputing that.
Bruce, that's true. I think part of the reason for the inconsistency between his lawyers last week saying he can't possibly make his bond and him saying I've got $500 million in cash is that Donald Trump wants to portray to his supporters that he's successful. His wealth and that fortune is important to him. And so you saw last week a little bit of an inconsistency between his lawyers and Donald Trump. But yesterday, because the appellate court in New York reduced it to $175 million, they'll both be on the same page, and I expect him to post that bond.
He can't borrow this money. He has to pay it personally.
He's got to have the assets for it. And so he can go to lenders, he can go to banks, he can go to others, but I expect him to post the bond.
All right, let's go to the hush money case. Judge set the trial for April 15th. That left Donald Trump seething. People who saw him coming out of the courtroom say he was mad. That leaves us with the possibility that for the first time in history, a presidential candidate faces a possible criminal conviction. That's unheard of.
Bruce, it does, but it's a two-edged sword for many people who oppose Donald Trump. On the one hand, they're pleased to see him going to trial. On the other hand, this is not the case they would have chosen. This hush money case, remember, it was in the Manhattan DA's office with Vance. He declined to prosecute. The Southern District of New York refused to prosecute. The Federal Elections Commission refused to find an elections violation. And Alvin Bragg decided to go forward with this one. And this is the one that's fairly complicated. Some of the misdemeanors have already passed the statute of limitations, so they've made it into a business records case that calls into play a violation of a federal statute. So of the 4 prosecutions that Donald Trump is facing, I think this is the least significant and the greatest stretch. And like the Letitia James civil case, Donald Trump is using this one to say that this is politically motivated. And so this does go to trial on April 15th, or it's scheduled to go to trial on April 15th. You never know for sure. And of all the 4 cases, I don't think those who oppose Trump wanted to lead with this one. The more serious cases are the Jack Smith cases out of D.C. on election interference and the Jack Smith case in Florida on the documents case. Those are very serious with very compelling evidence.
And they probably won't go to trial before November.
A lot will depend on what the Supreme Court says in June in terms of timing. It is iffy as to whether either of those go to trial before November. We'll have to wait and see. The Supreme Court in April will be hearing oral arguments on the immunity case. They'll give their judgment, a ruling in June. Much may depend on the ruling of the U.S. Supreme Court.
But it was very interesting because in court yesterday, things got very testy with Judge Marchand and Trump's lawyers.
They did. I think the judge felt that the Trump lawyers were stretching the impact of the documents that had been produced from the U.S. Attorney's Office and were making allegations that the judge found to be unfounded. So it got a little bit heated. I would think that Donald Trump had learned by now, maybe not, that offending the judge is maybe a good strategy. That didn't go so well in the civil fraud case, especially when they're the fact finder. This judge will be presiding over the trial. He'll also be the one who imposes a sentence if there's a conviction. He may want to consider a little adjustment in strategy in terms of his relationship to the judge. But the judge wasn't pleased yesterday, and it's set to go to trial next month.
He had some not so kind words for Judge Engelron, who you see right there, who presided over the civil fraud trial, and he didn't have some kind words for Judge Marchand either. Of course, he's Donald Trump, and he could turn the trial into a stage for his campaign. He's done that in the past.
He has, Bruce, but I think he's going to find out that that may serve him well politically, but it's clearly not serving him well in the legal arena. For example, the civil fraud case, the judge that he insulted for political gain imposed a $355 million judgment against him. And he has other judges. The judge in the hush money case now is going to trial next month. And I think he's going to find it with the other judges in D.C. His political strategy and his legal strategy are a little bit at odds, but he's choosing a horse and he's choosing the political strategy. That's a big bet that he wins in November. We'll have to see.
I don't know how else to put this. Trump keeps stepping in it. He had to walk back comments about cutting back on Social Security. Not the first time he's done that. He's tiptoeing around the abortion issue. He can't find a message that doesn't offend either anti-abortion voters or suburban moderates. The man is not taking a stand on very sensitive issues in this nation right now. And these are issues that could very well sway the election. If you look back 4 years ago, there's no doubt the election was very close. And there's a segment of the electorate that could either put it in Trump's camp or in Biden's camp.
Bruce, there's no doubt about that. Now, from the other perspective, the 2 biggest changes, there's actually 3 biggest changes. The 3 biggest changes, I'd say, since 2020 to now that impact the election, number 1 is inflation. Since 2020 to now, after 40 years of inflation at 1 or 2%, it's been about 18% to 20% over the last 3 years. That is a change over the last 3 years that I think is impactful for November. A second one is going to be the border, and that's immigration. And they've had 8 to 9 million illegal immigrants coming over the border over the last 3 years. That's a change from 2020, very dramatic change. But the third one is what you're mentioning, the Dobbs case and abortion. And Republicans are on their heels. This has advantaged Joe Biden. And he's going to use the abortion issue, not just about abortion, but on a broader issue of freedom of choice, of democracy. And they used it effectively in the midterms in 2022. Remember, the Dobbs case came out after 2020. It came out the summer of 2022. This is a problem for Donald Trump. And as you just mentioned, he's been trying to find his footing. He floated a 16-week ban, thinking that's a bit of a compromise. He got criticized for the ban language, but it's certainly above the 15 weeks in the Mississippi case that was upheld in Dobbs. So as you look to November, what are those public policy issues that are going to be the most significant? Certainly the economy and inflation will be top of mind. Immigration will be a significant one. Abortion will be a very big issue. And on entitlement reform and Social Security, come November, everybody's going to close ranks. Nobody has the public policy courage to take that on. And so what you're going to see is on the Republican and Democratic side, they'll be aligned on that, which is there's not going to be any cuts on entitlement reform.
All right, let's talk about campaign cash. Trump is running low on campaign cash, and now he's using campaign funds to pay for his legal expenses. The FEC is not going to get involved. Is it legal for him to go ahead and do that?
Well, a lot of what you're seeing with sort of the takeover of the Republican Party by his team, by his daughter-in-law, and by others, is they're going to put donors, of course, on notice that if they're going to contribute, that some of this may go to legal fees. But there's no doubt that it's disadvantaged Donald Trump, advantaged Joe Biden when it comes to fundraising.
Biden's out fundraising.
Biden has an enormous lead now. I expect that to continue, and that will continue through November. Hillary Clinton outspent Donald Trump 2-1 back in 2016. But it is complicated for Donald Trump by these cases. Some like to say that they're somewhat to his political advantage. Maybe yes, maybe no. He uses them in a very political way. But it is not to his advantage financially, and it is not to his advantage in terms of campaigning, in which he's going to be in court and he's got legal proceedings all the time. So you raise an important point, because the fundraising piece of this is important. Donald Trump is the master of earned media. He got a lot of earned media in 2016 and in 2020 and in 2024. I like to put it as there's Trump 1.0, Trump 2.0, and Trump 3.0. They share some similarities, but there's some differences in those three versions. But this is going to be a challenge from now through November for the Trump campaign, and that is fundraising.
Yeah, and there are some people who sit back and say, okay, well, he's got his social media network that now is going to earn him about $1 billion in cash, but that money is not going to be available to him for something like, what is it, 6 months?
Bruce, typically, and of course it got a bump yesterday, and supposedly a big, almost $3 to $4 million in assets for him. But typically he can't sell any of that, and if he does, it could really deflate the stock. Now remember, the 7 people who make this decision are all very favorable towards Donald Trump. Can they waive those provisions? They can. Can they phase in some of that so he could sell a portion of this over 90 days? That's possible, but that could have a very detrimental effect on the stock. So we'll have to wait and see whether that becomes a source of funds for Donald Trump.
Also be interesting to see what he says on Truth Social that just blow up in his face. Speaking of things that he's addressed on the campaign trail over the past week or so. First, now if I don't get elected, it's going to be a bloodbath for the whole nation. That's going to be the least of it. It's going to be a bloodbath for the country. Then he goes on to say, if this election isn't won, I'm not sure that you'll ever have another election in this country. All right. So I talked about this in the context of the news story when he was in Ohio, and people said, whoa, wait a second. He backtracked on that, and he said it was in the context of what was happening with China and the auto industry. And I said, well, wait, you know, if you listen to everything he was talking about, China does not sell electric vehicles in this country. So what was Donald Trump really talking about?
Well, Bruce, this is an example of where Trump 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0 agree. It's a similarity, which is he makes provocative statements that are capable of interpretation from a Democratic view or a Republican view. But it is important to know the context. This was a case in which he was talking about China in Mexico building a plant for the production of electronic vehicles. And he said he was going to impose a 100% tariff on China so that those electronic vehicles would not be sold in the United States. And in that context, right after that, he said, if that doesn't happen, there will be a bloodbath. And then after the bloodbath, he talked about autos. The Republican defense is that the bloodbath referred to, of course, the auto industry.
But isn't there a non sequitur because those cars aren't sold here?
Well, I don't think necessarily share that view, because in the context of the reason that China is building those electronic vehicles was to sell them here. And that was his purpose of the $100 million, of the 100% tariff. In addition, in Michigan, as he very well knows, while Joe Biden is concerned about the Palestinian vote and Arab Americans, there's a working class vote in Michigan with those auto dealers. And you saw this over the past week, where the Biden administration is easing up on some of the regulations on electronic vehicles, in part because those workers are concerned about what Donald Trump is talking about, whether that's going to cost them their jobs. And as we've seen in other areas, it comes back to self-interest and concern for your economic future. So I think, in fairness, there is an argument on both sides. But the Trump argument is that the context for that argument was the auto industry, electronic vehicles, China's building them, and the notion of a 100% tariff, which should have been the bigger topic. Instead, it became the bloodbath. And we have seen time and time again in 2016, in 2020, and 2024, in which the language used by Donald Trump really causes a stir. And sometimes he's defended, sometimes he gets criticized on one hand and defended on the other, and sometimes it's not easy to defend at all. And I'm sure we'll talk about some of those too.
Yeah, so in this case, you're saying it's Donald Trump being Donald Trump, and maybe he just started straying all over the place, and that's why things were taken out of context.
I think there's an argument here that the argument made by his defenders is that this related to the auto industry, just as there was a criticism recently by some that the RNC had a bloodbath when they got rid of the old guard and brought in Donald Trump supporters. They used the young language bloodbath, but I don't think they were talking about political violence.
Talking about the Republican National Committee. All right, how about this inflammatory statement? And I don't know how you can defend this, but here we go. Any Jewish person that votes for Democrats hates their religion, they hate everything about Israel, and they should be ashamed of themselves because Israel will be destroyed.
Bruce, in my humble opinion, there's no defending that comment. And not to be inflammatory on both sides, but it's reminiscent of 2020 when Joe Biden said, if you're black and vote for Donald Trump, you're not black. Now, that comment back in 2020 was inappropriate. This comment is inappropriate. But Joe Biden had a reason for it because he was talking about the public policy issues surrounding African Americans and how he was more helpful. There is a bigger context. That statement's indefensible. But the bigger context is the public policy in relationship to Israel and Hamas. And in particular, what the Senate Majority Leader did, Chuck Schumer, when he called for Netanyahu to have new elections for basically the overthrow of Netanyahu. And a shift in the Biden position in which they were looking to Gaza, and all of a sudden now it's an immediate ceasefire without necessarily the conditions of the release of the hostages. And you saw yesterday in the United Nations when the United States abstained and the United Nations passed a resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza without the release of the hostages as a condition of it. So there's a bigger context here. The context for Donald Trump is, if you take a look at what Schumer is saying, if you take a look at the shift towards Gaza, the concern that the Biden administration has about Israel going forward in Rafah because Hamas is in Rafah, that is the context. I don't think there's any defending that statement, but that is the background to it. The Israel-Hamas conflict is a big topic for November. It's a big topic, and that, inartful is kind, that unacceptable statement by Trump has a bigger context, and that is what's going on here. Joe Biden knows that in Michigan and in Minnesota in particular, he's got a political issue here, and he's trying to address it by some shifting policies.
Which is why the Biden administration made it clear that if Netanyahu moves into Rafah, and I think even Kamala Harris backed up, there will be consequences.
The consequences won't be the removal of support in terms of equipment, but yes, they have warned them of that. But this goes back to a fundamental question. Hamas has strategically positioned themselves using the civilian population in Gaza.
Which they always do.
And knowing very well that they would be casualties, and the casualties have been horrific and unacceptable, certainly. But you have a very fundamental issue, which is the security of Israel and the elimination of Hamas. And Hamas has embedded themselves within that population. Israel claims that they're doing everything possible they can to minimize civilian casualties, although there have been extraordinary civilian casualties, but that their fundamental objective for their own survival is the elimination of Hamas. That is a big public policy question, a big challenge in Israel, and a big challenge in this election.
And Hamas knows very well that it's putting the United States and Israel in a no-win situation.
Really difficult. This is really a challenging one. Now, I'll tell you, there are some easy pieces. The October 7th attack by Hamas, unequivocal condemnation by everyone, where 1,200 Israelis are slaughtered and raped, a horrific thing. The response of Israel to say we're going to root out Hamas is understandable, but the challenge is the suffering that's going on in Gaza and the suffering that's going on in that area. And that is really, really difficult.
Nobody's going to deny that the Palestinian people are going through a lot. And they deserve to be protected. They deserve to get food. They deserve to get, things to sustain themselves. They deserve to be protected. But the people of Hamas and the leaders of Hamas need to be taken out because they are putting their very people in an untenable position.
It was done by Hamas. It was done by design. And Israel's very straightforward in its approach. Their security for the future depends on the elimination of Hamas, and that's what they're determined to do.
Okay. On the January 6th insurrection, I find it interesting that all of a sudden, Ronna McDaniel, this is back to the RNC issue,
yes.
All of a sudden, the former RNC chair ousted by Donald Trump does a flip-flop and says, the January 6th attack does not represent my country. Biden won fair and square. And when she was the RNC chair, she says, I took one for the team. Man, did she do a flip-flop.
She did. That was a big topic this weekend because she's now a paid contributor for NBC. And you may have seen that Chuck Todd, in kind of an extraordinary statement over the weekend, criticized NBC for hiring her as a paid consultant, given what you just outlined.
He's not the only one at NBC now.
Yeah, well, but live on television on a Sunday morning show, and it's your boss, it was kind of an interesting comment. But yes, what you've seen, of course, you look at the other channels. You have the former head of the DNC or the RNC as commentators. They wanted to get her, but yes, that has been very controversial. It's been talked about quite a bit, and she's going to be a paid contributor for NBC News.
Doesn't it go to show that there are some people in the RNC leadership and in the Republican Party as well who become two-faced and they're beholden to Donald Trump and they're afraid of Donald Trump?
Bruce, there's a fracture in the Republican Party that's very challenging for them to navigate. And the Republican Party is not monolithic. There is a base, of course, a very strong base of support for Donald Trump. There is a significant percentage. You saw it with Nikki Haley, 25 to 30%, and you saw it in New Hampshire, and you saw it in South Carolina, you saw it in other states.
So you got 14% of the vote here.
And it was over. And so there is that fracture, but it is challenging to navigate. And they know very well from a political standpoint that they jeopardize their political futures if they're not careful with how they navigate that. And I think the RNC has very much been caught in the middle of that, in the crosshairs of that, and they haven't navigated it very well.
But Donald Trump won't give it up. What did he say in Ohio? Please rise for the horribly and unfairly treated January 6th hostages. Unbelievable patriots. You see the spirit from the hostages, and that's what they are, hostages. Isn't it time for him to give that up?
Bruce, my earlier comment is there's a Donald Trump 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0. This is Donald Trump 3.0. And I think this is potentially something that could cost him the election in November. And that is his preoccupation with what happened with 2020 and looking backward. And his preoccupation with those who were convicted and charged for the riot and for what happened on January 6th. On this particular instance, in his language here, this is not one where he's being supported by many Republicans. He did have defense on the bloodbath comment. On the Israeli issue, there are those who are trying to put it in context. Very few, if any, Republicans are suggesting, there are some, but it's really not the majority, are suggesting that look back to 2020 and that this was acceptable by any means. But for Donald Trump, it is a preoccupation of his. This is not something, by the way, when he does this, he's playing to his MAGA base. That is not an effort to bring in the Haley voters. The Haley voters aren't going to come in on that basis. The moderates aren't going to come in on that basis. The independents. Instead of him being forward-looking and talking about inflation or talking about immigration or talking about crime or talking about whatever he wants to talk about from a policy standpoint, to the extent he looks back and to the extent he says that he's going to do this, he loses that support. Vice President Pence himself parted ways with Donald Trump on this very comment, saying he would not support him on this. The Wall Street Journal was vocal in their opposition to what Donald Trump said here. Over the months that play out to November, if he continues down this path, I suggest that could undermine his viability as a presidential candidate.
Right. Look, I go back to where we started. There are so many things that could change the complexion of this election. You highlighted many of them. Immigration, the economy, the situation between Israel and Gaza. Campaign cash, and Donald Trump being Donald Trump. I mean, there are people in his own party who say that. The Republicans, they can undo themselves. Look at what Marjorie Taylor Greene is doing with Mike Johnson right now. I mean, that smacks of some things that happened when they tried to unseat House Speaker McCormick.
It was the exact same thing, and it was on the shutdown. Bruce, I believe that today, as we look to November, this election simply is too close to call. And despite the fact that Donald Trump has a current lead in the polls, it's small. And there's a lot that's going to happen between now and November. You can easily see Donald Trump winning. You can easily see Joe Biden winning. I can't easily predict who's going to win. That because there's so many variables between now and November. We talked about some earlier. The Supreme Court decisions, oral arguments next month, and then the decisions in June. Are there going to be federal trials? What happens in the Bragg case? What about the fundraising effort? You can have the Republican convention in July, the Democratic convention in August. And of course, we will see whether there's going to be debates. I'm not so sure there will. But this, as you've highlighted in this program, Donald Trump has had some self-inflicted wounds on the campaign trail. Donald Trump is Donald Trump. And although we have a very effective person from Jacksonville who's managing his campaign, I'm confident
talking about Susie Wines.
She does not control what he says. She does have a big influence on providing some structure, some organization, and some smarts in bringing people together. But his comments and his self-inflicted wounds are going to continue. Whether that costs him the election, it might, but we will see. But it's a binary choice. It is a choice that the American people don't want. Most of the polling suggests that this is not the choice they want, which, by the way, makes the third-party candidacies all that more significant this year. We've certainly seen other cases where Jill Stein in 2016, Ralph Nader in 2000, Ross Perot in 1992 really had an effect on the outcome of the race. That could happen again this year.
So let me ask you about RFK Jr. What did he float the other day? I might go libertarian. Even the Kennedy family is saying, okay, we're getting back behind Biden right now. Does he just become a fracture in this whole thing?
Well, today he's going to announce his VP candidate. Some think it's going to be Shanahan out of California, who's got deep pockets and can help him get on the ballots in a number of different states because there's an effort to keep them off the ballot. But he's really, if you look at the polling, he's potentially in Ross Perot territory at 15 to 20%. Some real thought has to be given to what does that candidacy mean? Not can he win, he can't win. The question is, how does he skew the election when it comes to Trump and to Biden? There's more concern on the Biden side, but there should be some concern on the Trump side also. This may be a state-by-state difference. But that third-party candidacy could affect the outcome. Another one, and they're struggling to find a candidate, is no labels. I know that the Biden campaign in particular does not want no labels to have a candidate because that's an off-ramp for those people who don't like the choices we have. They could go with no labels, potentially RFK, or even you have other third parties. In this year's election in particular, third-party candidates could very much affect this outcome.
Nobody knows what's going to happen. And, you know, Joe Biden, he's in control of his own fate, too. He's had some missteps. He can't communicate effectively about what's happening in the economy. Just look in Florida. There are so many places that are up for grabs. And there are so many places that say, all right, Joe, you keep saying, I'm Scranton Joe. I get it. He doesn't get it about the economy. He doesn't get it that you may think the economy is doing well, but it's not about the stock market. It's about the grocery checkout counter and things like that. That's not where you're communicating what needs to happen, where things need to change. It's at the grocery stores, at the gas pump, and places like that.
Well, Bruce, the old Bill Clinton strength when they say, I feel your pain, and he could show that empathy for the voter and for the citizen. This is one where Joe Biden historically has been known as an empathetic figure. This is one where there's been a little bit of a disconnect in understanding that when interest rates on housing, for example, have gone from 3% to 7%, when housing prices have skyrocketed, making it really tough for first-time home buyers and others. For an elderly population in which inflation makes it hard to make ends meet, and for that young couple just starting out, or for those who are really struggling, the inflation number, it may be inconvenient if you're well off. It's not just inconvenient if you're elderly or if you're poor, middle class. And that is where he needs to understand why, despite the fact that GDP has grown, despite the fact there's been new jobs, despite the fact you have low unemployment, and stock market is up, despite those good numbers, why this disconnect? And the disconnect is pretty straightforward. Many people are struggling due to inflation, and there's another factor. Many people feel insecure about their future. Even though their net worth may feel a little bit better, because of inflation and because of the insecurity, they're concerned about the future. And that concern about the future and that challenge of making ends meet today is one of the reasons why people aren't buying the argument that this economy is great, because it doesn't feel great for them. And he really does need to understand that a little bit better, I think.
Got to get to the bottom line. Both candidates do. Rick, always eye-opening. You always give us great context, perspective, and focus. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Bruce.
All right, if you want to watch this show on demand or share it with your friends, you can do that on the News4JAX YouTube channel, News4JAX Plus, and News4JAX.com. You want to weigh in? You can find me at bhamilton@wjxt.com. You can share whatever your thoughts are with me. You can agree to disagree with me. All I ask is that you be civil about it, and I will answer your emails. Have a great day.
See why every day more people are choosing News4JAX, Northeast Florida and South Georgia's #1 source for local news.